identify what fraud investigation is, we must first identify what is fraud. Fraud in simplest term is violations of trust. It is an intentionally deceptive action established to provide the perpetrator with an unlawful gain or unfair advantage or to deny a right to a victim. Thus, fraud relates to intentional acts and false representations of facts that cause misstatements of the financial statements such as misappropriations of assets. The risk of fraud can be mitigated by conducting fraud investigation. Fraud investigation is activities conducted to determine whether a scam has taken place and gathering evidence to protect the victim involved. It consists of examining evidence to determine if a fraud occurred, how it happened, who was involved, and how much money was lost. Fraud investigation is crucial in resolving fraud allegations from inception to deposition. It requires proper procedures, techniques, and skill as to conduct an effective fraud investigation and ensure the fraudulent transaction or activities can be minimized or eliminated. There are several reasons there is an issue in fraud investigation. Fraud investigation is vital in organization as it detects any possibilities of fraudulent activities. In Malaysia, 41% of Malaysian companies report being a victim to fraud and economic crime, where the fraud is discovered too late. In one case, Hong Kong court acquits former director of one of Hong Kong's largest mandatory pension fund advisors together with his associates since there is not enough evidence. From this case, we can see that it is important to get the strong evidence as a proof of someone to commit fraud. In addition, there is a need in investigating fraudulent activities since the cases related to fraud keep on increasing. For example, Lucas, a company involved in the sale of new and used cars across UK, uncovers £46 million loss after fraud investigation. It is found that there was an overstated in bonuses and fraudulent expense claims. From all the cases, we can clearly see fraud investigation is crucial to prevent fraudulent activities since it can lead to unbearable losses to the company. And all too often, in some cases, its damage is irreversible. The fraud does more than impact the bottom line. For instance, it causes damage to the reputations of the company, affect the shareholder trust, and also employee morale. Moreover, there will be a significant and lasting cost of enforcement and litigation.
Hello, my name is Hanis, and now let me explain how the issues are related to internal audit function. Some companies have personnel committed to the detection of fraud. Irrespective of whether the fraud detection procedure starts, the research continues until there is uncertainty, which means that there are signs or signals of warning signs that there may be fraud. It is a compliance measure that ensures that internal controls are carried out by reviewing and assessing the adequacy, efficiency, and performance of internal control system. According to the IIA 2009, internal auditors must be conscious of instances of fraud, probable indicators of fraud, and the reason why employees commit fraud. Internal auditors need to set up processes and internal controls to discourage workers from being placed in a position to retain fraud and to identify illegal practices when they occur. Internal auditors also will need to consider fraud strategies and situations as well as the signs that lead to fraud and how to avoid it. Knowledge of fraud schemes also focus on annual analysis by administration and independent regulator, staff training and daily contact among administration and workers. There are various functions of internal auditors in conducting fraud risk assessment. The first move that internal auditors should take is to obtain evidence of the business activities of the company in order to gain an overview of the consequences of fraud, including relevant client interaction participants. Next is, internal auditor shall classify possible fraudulent scheme by way of brainstorming, management interviews, analytical processes, and analysis of past fraud. Third step involves internal auditor must identify the protective and investigate safeguards in order to resolve any risk of crime and to assess the likelihood and importance of any fraudulent activity. After detecting potential fraud, internal auditor should inform the auditor who knows how to protect the credibility of the company and to protect against the liability of the injured parties or even the party involved in the fraud. The internal auditors must report significant risk exposures and control problems to senior management and the board on a periodic basis, including the fraud threats. And lastly, management shall regularly inform the board on the status and outcomes of the risk assessment of fraud. Example that we can relate in this issue that related to internal audit function, there is one case in New Jersey. A former internal auditor at NJ Transit had claims in an email sent to the state and federal officials Monday morning that agency has lack of controls that allowed fraud to take place, lacks transparency for internal investigation, and has no established standard for bus maintenance. Thomas Bojowski, as an NJT Internal Audit Director, detect the matter that the internal controls and management organization weaknesses that have allowed fraud to take place, so he addressed various important issues through numerous meetings, emails and reports. That's all from my part. Thank you.
Hi, I am Batrisha. Now we will look on how internal auditors help to investigate or solve the fraud. Organizations investigate whether there is accusations or allegation of misconduct within the organization for potential fraud. Investigations work includes preparing, documenting, and preserving evidence adequate for potential legal proceedings. Management is responsible for developing controls over the investigation process, including developing policies and procedures. Such standards are often documented in a fraud policy, and the internal auditors may assist in the evaluations of policy. When the internal audit activity is responsible for the investigation, it may investigate using in-house staff, outsourcing, or a combination of both. For any investigation, an investigation plan is established, following the investigation procedures or protocols of the organization. The plan should consider the following investigative activities such gathering evidence through surveillance, interviews, or written statements that determining the extent of the fraud, the techniques used to perpetrate the fraud, evaluating the cause of the fraud, and also identifying the perpetrators. Specific procedures employed in each investigation will differ based on the specific situation and the goals of the investigative team. The common investigative procedures include obtaining evidence and interviewing. In obtaining evidence, the investigation team may use computer forensic procedures or computer-assisted data analysis based on the nature of the allegations, the results of the procedures performed, and the goals of the investigation. Some examples of evidence include letters, memos, and correspondence both in hard copy or electronic form, IT or system access records, internal phone records, and others. Apart from that, an internal auditor will interview individuals such as witnesses and facilitating personnel. Generally, the defendant is interviewed by two people, which are an experienced investigator and another individual who takes notes during the interview. Thereafter, reporting fraud investigations to senior management and or the board regarding the status and results of fraud investigations. Furthermore, internal auditors should incorporate the results of risk assessments into their planning. By targeting the high-risk areas identified, proactive anti-fraud work can be undertaken that is both proportionate to business needs and valuable. This is an example based on the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners in 2014.
Roles and contribution of internal auditor in fraud investigations. The roles and contribution of internal auditor consists of consider the presence of the fraud risk and examine how organization manage the fraud, alert that fraud will occur in the organizations, ensure the effectiveness of the internal control and fraud risk management, help the management to identify the essential indicators of the fraud scheme that occur in the organization, and lastly, examine the weaknesses in internal control during the progression of the fraud investigations. The first role is consider the presence of the fraud risk and examine how the organization manage the fraud. Internal auditors should use their expertise in order to analyze the set of data to identify the trends and patterns that might suggest fraud. If the knowledge and expertise are not available in the organization, they should consider to recruit another resources in order to detect and prevent the fraud. The internal auditor also should alert that the fraud will occur in the organizations. An internal auditor can assist the fraud by examining and evaluating the effectiveness of the internal control. Internal auditor may be responsible and assisting the management in establishing the effective fraud prevention in order to measure the organization's strengths and weaknesses and provide the consulting expertise for the organization. Other than that, the internal auditor should ensure the effectiveness of the internal control and the fraud risk management. Internal auditors are responsible in relation to the fraud of the risk management, which include the investigation towards the suspected fraud, root cause analysis, and control improvement recommendations. In order to conduct the investigation, the internal auditor have to ensure that they have sufficient knowledge and skill, which includes the knowledge of fraud schemes and investigation laws and the technology. Besides that, the internal auditor needs to help the management in order to identify the essential indicator of the fraud scheme that could occur in the company. For example, the incident of the red flag fraud, which referring to the unfavorable circumstances or conditions that regularly lead to the resource fraud, waste and violence. Therefore, the internal auditor needs to ensure that the internal audit will assist the management to identify the fraud that occur in the organizations. The last role and contribution of the internal auditor is examine the weaknesses in the internal control during the progression of the fraud investigation. Forensic investigation can be carried out to locate the facts of a crime and to present it in a manner that can hold up in a court of law, as the internal auditor can review the organization's financial record, which is a major task that can require the internal auditor's professional.
Let's move to the challenges of internal auditors in investigating fraud. The first one is lack of volatility in audit tests. Auditors are usually not known to adjust their testing methods from one exercise to another. This is because their attention remains on the basic control levels and transactions taking place. This makes audit testing predictable to the employees since they are already aware of the complexity of the audit and opportunities under auditors' radar. Adding a surprise element in the audit test may be an effective tool and useful in detecting and preventing fraud. The second one is sampling is not enough to catch the whole picture of the business. Sampling is commonly used by the auditors to test the transaction during the audit process. An inherent sampling drawback is that all transactions are not tested, therefore creating a high risk that a fraudulent transaction will not be detected in the sample of the auditors and thus will go undiscovered. The third one is fraudsters might take advantage from inexperienced internal auditors. Most of the audit firms' business model nowadays depending on the inexperienced internal auditors to conduct the major component in audit process. Usually, the new and inexperienced auditors are unable to decide what kind of questions should be asked and challenge the management's decision.
Hence, the fraudster can pacify the busy auditor by faking the paperwork and other related documents. Auditor with inadequate experience and skill might have difficulties in recognizing the suspicious transaction and fraudulent documentation. That's all from us. Thank you.